Has the world ignored South Sudan? The country is facing extreme hunger, and aid agencies are warning of dire consequences if violence carries on. So what can be done to save Africa's youngest country? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Hashem Ahelbarra. Humanitarian groups are warning 60% of South Sudan's population will face catastrophic famine by the middle of next year. That's if aid can't reach areas affected by floods, violence, and the pandemic. A joint report by 3 UN agencies says 6.5 million people in the region are facing starvation, and that number could rise by almost 1 million by July. Aid agencies blame the worsening situation on violence that's made it impossible to produce food and dangerous and difficult to deliver aid. Last month, the UN released $7 million in emergency funding to try to avert famine. The country is still struggling to emerge from a 6-year civil war that killed tens of thousands of people. We'll bring in our guests shortly, but first, let's take a look at the history of Africa's youngest country. In July 2011, South Sudan gained independence from Sudan, but war broke out 2 years later when President Salva Kiir accused his former deputy and former rebel leader Riek Machar of plotting a coup. The fighting killed about 400,000 people and displaced millions. Ceasefire was signed in January 2014, but was violated several times, and further talks failed to end the violence. In September 2018, Kiir agreed to set up a unity government with Machar, but that was delayed as they tried to resolve outstanding disputes. In February, the pair finally formed a unity government, declared an end to the civil war. Joining me now are our guests in Juba. Matthew Hollingworth, South Sudan Country Director for the World Food Programme. In Oxford, Douglas Johnson, former member of the Abyei Boundary Commission and author of South Sudan, A New History for a New Nation. Also in Juba, Jeffrey Duke, Security Analyst and Director of the South Sudan Action Network on Small Arms. Welcome to you all. Matthew, United Nations agencies have been saying for quite some time that areas in South Sudan are on the brink of famine. However, the response didn't really match with the magnitude of the problem. Why is that?
I think, well, first of all, hello to everybody. Sadly, I think we've been warning for a number of months now, most of this year, that the accumulation of national, subnational, and localized conflict in the country, married to a second year of unprecedented flooding, has meant that this country is now facing food insecurity at a scale that it has not faced before. More than 7.5 or more or less 7.5 million people expected to need food assistance by the lean season of 2021 is an unprecedented level. What we have been struggling to do is to reach areas of the country where the most vulnerable are living, primarily because of conflict earlier in this year, and then by floods when the conflict waned. We've also been struggling to get the kinds of resources we need to give people a full ration to help them get on their feet and to help them rebuild their lives after times of conflict and natural disaster. When you add to that this year's economic collapse, which is also largely due to COVID-19, the impact of that, but also diminishing oil reserves or oil resources, and you've got a recipe for a food security disaster in South Sudan.
Douglas, you have climate change, you have violence, you have instability, and this is a grim reminder for a nation that about 9 years ago was raising hopes among the international community that it could become a vibrant new democracy in the African continent. What do you think has been completely wrong with this nation?
This reminds me of my own time working with World Food Programme during the Operation Lifeline Sudan, where we've had similar periods where there have been extreme flooding, pandemic diseases, especially among livestock, and also factional fighting. So two things I think are important to think about or to suggest in this current problem is that, one, there's been a failure of governance, and part of that failure is the inability to create a disciplined national army. A lot of the fighting and the oppression of civilians, which has prevented cultivation or prevented harvest, has been down to elements of the South Sudan Defense Force rampaging through civilian areas, and also creating opposition with armed groups who are either there to protect themselves or to take advantage of chaos. So that's a failure of governance, and that's a failure of the current government. And we shouldn't make any excuses for them. This is something that should have been attempted and should have been set up of a disciplined national army a long time ago. As far as the other problems, the area of Jonglei, for instance, has been an area that has experienced extreme floods before that have interfered with communication networks, etc. But there are also other areas that are usually have high production that have been disturbed by the fighting. Also, there has been a failure of the government to provide communication networks, road networks, the sorts of things that are needed to move supplies, food from one place to another.
Let me go to Jeffrey in Juba. Jeffrey, why is the government, in a way or another, not willing to recognize the scale of the famine in the country?
Well, I wouldn't enter into the politics of declaration of famine in the country, but for those who want to know whether people are starving or not, you can visit where these communities live and speak to them directly, because I don't want it to be Jeffrey declaring famine in South Sudan or aid agencies. But let's recognize that the famine that might be looming is a product of displacement, and this sort of displacement is not new to South Sudan. It was there even before the 2013 civil war, which it is something around intercommunal violence. In the absence of state security, communities get attacked and they seek revenge. And in this cycle of revenge, which often manifests in form of large-scale violence and use of military-style weapons, the folks end up, just looking for their survival, but not, growing crops as done in other parts of the world. And Jonglei State is notorious for such a fashion of intercommunal violence.
Matthew, the government did not endorse the Famine Review Committee's report that was released this month by the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification. Is the government trying to say this has been blown out of proportion by the international aid agencies?
I think there is a consensus, as you know, between the Famine Review Committee, which is an independent group of experts that can be called in to look at data when there isn't consensus at the country level. They haven't agreed with that, but I think it's more important to look at what has been agreed. There is consensus on the 7.24 million people who are in severe acute food insecurity. There is consensus on that. There is consensus that there are 5 or 6 locations in the country with pockets of famine. There isn't consensus on the scale of that likelihood of famine or risk of famine, but there is consensus on the fact that there is a very significant crisis that we need to respond to if we are to prevent what would be a full-blown famine. Because we're not talking about declaring a full-blown famine at this stage. We're talking about the likelihood of famine and the risk of famine and what we can do to respond to stop it in its tracks. That in itself is not going to be easy. And you've heard why from the other panelists in terms of, I mean, South Sudan is a country 2.5 times the size of the United Kingdom. There's 200 kilometers of paved road in the whole country. This is an incredibly difficult country to move around when there's peace. It's an incredibly difficult country to move things around when there aren't natural disasters to cope with. And we haven't had that peace in some of these locations this year. And we've been facing unprecedented levels of flooding, as I said, and all of the complexities that COVID-19's thrown up in terms of supply chain interruption. You've got communities that did not or could not cultivate land this year because of fighting. You've got communities that lost their harvests to flooding. You've got communities that lost their cattle and their sheep and their goats to flooding. And so you've got, like I said, this recipe for disaster that we are going to need to respond to. And the politics aside, that's already going to be very complicated. It will be impossible unless there is stability and peace in those areas. So I agree that that's such an important aspect. There has to be an understanding that the weapons need to be put down so that humanitarians and development workers and peace-building workers could get on with their job on bringing communities together, connecting communities, and trying to give them the livelihood that will give them their futures.
Douglas, for the time being, the international community has been putting more pressure on all the parties in South Sudan to set aside their differences, rein in violence, and allow the aid agencies to operate on the ground. You look at the hard-hit areas, Piba, further expanding towards Warab, Jonglei, and northern Bahr al-Ghazal states. We're talking about a situation that could easily spin out of control and become a full-blown famine.
Well, yes. I mean, this is what everybody is trying to prevent, and I honestly don't understand the reluctance of the current government or even some of the opposition groups for refusing to recognize that. I just remember what we used to do in Operation Lifeline Sudan, and if you can get access to some of the reports from 20 or so years ago, you'll see what was possible at that time during a war situation with environmental disasters contributing to it. Again, I do not understand. Some of the people who are involved in the government were very much involved in the Operation Lifeline Sudan episodes, negotiating with the UN, with the World Food Programme and various other agencies. So they have the experience of how to deal with these combination of disasters. They have that background and experience. And it's something that they should be able to draw on to prevent this spiraling out of control, as you say.
Jeffrey, when you look at what is happening on the ground, the UN is saying that its patrols are now in place to monitor areas like Maniabol, Legongul, Dokpariat, Uai, and Wat. And that's where the tension between the communities has been on the rise. Would that be on its own enough to contain the crisis and rein in the tension which has been going up?
I think the crisis might be centered in those areas, but it has to be, a statewide focus, like the whole of Jonglei state, because these communities have been wreaking violence against each other, like across. It's not only the communities in those pointed areas, like in People, the Greater People administrative area is hardly hit by, the double tragedy of both violence and flood. So I would say the focus needs to be the entire state, and of course, being the state hard hit by intercommunal violence, the government should really focus on quickly terminating violence by way of facilitating a negotiation of some ceasefire of some sort among the communities. Because we have to note that the peace agreement did not have, any framework for ceasefire among communities. That's why we see much as violence between and among the parties of the peace agreement has dramatically gone down. The intercommunal violence has persisted throughout. So it has to begin by negotiating some sort of ceasefire. And then within that, conversation, negotiation of access for humanitarian, actors, and then another dialogue segment focusing on addressing the real root causes of this intercommunal violence. And of course, one of it is the culture of impunity, where armed youth can organize and go to a neighboring community and direct violence and come back to their home and sit without any fear of accountability or any sort of justice. And that has to stop. And so the government and, peace actors need to negotiate such sort of arrangement.
All right. Matthew, the World Food Programme says it needs something like almost $500 million over the next 6 months to be able to cope with the magnitude of this disaster. Now, do you think the international community is expressing an appetite to step in against the backdrop of what we're seeing on the ground?
I mean, I think we have enormously generous donors, member states that have stood by South Sudan when it was Southern Sudan during the Operation Lifeline program that was referred to earlier, and since independence in 2011. And those member states are still wanting to see a successful country continue to grow, to be prosperous, to be peaceful. And if those donors can see that this country is going to be stable and that unity will maintain, they'll continue to support. But I fear that if they see that they're going to be throwing good money after bad, they won't. I think it's really important, just following on from the last question, that, in areas like the Greater Pibor Administrative Area in Greater Jonglei State, these are areas where, the dialogue side of things has been going in fits and starts for many years. But conflict keeps on recurring. And it's that persistent and recurring conflict that is part of the cause of what we're seeing, the catastrophic food insecurity in areas that we're seeing, not just in Jonglei State this year. That has to change. But the importance for people living in those areas, of course, is that, frankly, you can't eat dialogue. You can't live off dialogue. Those families, those communities, they need jobs. Those families, those communities, they need a livelihood. They need to be connected to markets so that they can actually access the sort of basic staples which are available in other parts of the country that are less remote. Now, but without that sort of that access to basic services, to market forces, you're going to see a continuation of the crisis, because, as was rightly said, without dealing with root causes, part of the root cause is the deprivation, the marginalization of some of these communities. Without dealing with that, sadly, it's going to be more assistance that is going to be provided and less development. And that's the equation we need to turn on its head.
Let's talk about that particular equation, and let me go to Douglas. Douglas, let's face it, one of the biggest problems here is the huge differences between Salva Kiir and Riek Machar. Do you think that we will be able in the near future to convince these two rivals to set aside their differences, move forward, turn a chapter, pave the way for stability and peace in South Sudan?
Well, I know that people have been trying to persuade them to put aside their differences, and There has been a feeling abroad within the country and outside of the country that actually both men have had a long run in the history of South Sudan in governance in one way or another. And if they both agreed to an honorable retirement and allowed other people to come forward to be able to deal with these problems, that might be the beginning of a real sense of not just of dialogue, but of trying to tackle the problems of South Sudan and divorce them from the past, to move on from the problems that were created within the liberation struggle. I would just like to say that what Matthew has said is quite true about the importance of markets and livelihood. And I would point out that there are signs within Jonglei of different civilian groups that are trying to not just foster dialogue, but to change the equation between the communities. They're small, they need support, they need recognition. But there is something there within the civilian population of Jonglei and other parts of South Sudan of individuals and groups that are willing to try to carve out a new path and change the patterns of disturbance and disruption.
Okay. Jeffrey, we've been talking about the unity government. One of the key components of that deal was basically the transitional security arrangements. You need to have a professional army that brings about stability and security. How can you achieve that when the country is divided along ethnic tribal lines?
Well, it is definitely unrealistic to expect people who have been, on each other's throats to come together very soon after, the last battle, and then form a cohesive national army. But it is definitely something that has to be a long-term goal, because we need, South Sudan needs an army that reflects its diversity and that, can be disciplined and etc. But the problem here is that the parties tend to use, the issue of, graduating the necessary unified force as a prerequisite for progress in implementation of the peace agreement. Even issues that does not require the necessary unified force are not being implemented. For example, just appointing the officials, but the parliament, the governors, deputy governors, commissioners, and etc., which does not require, a unified force, is not being done. So this raises the question of the willingness of the parties to really implement the peace agreement.
Let me go to Matthew. Matthew, this is going to be my last question in less than a minute, if you don't mind. Now, this is the dry season when people would be moving from an area to another towards sources of water. How are you concerned at this particular juncture?
I mean, the last time I was in Pibor was in October, and it was still covered in water. And then in December, I traveled to other parts of Greater Pibor, as well as to other parts of Jonglei. And whatever community we spoke to, and these are communities that were, the term used before, were at each other's throats previously, I heard the same story. The greatest fear is the moment the land starts to dry, that there will be more fighting. And that fighting will happen not just for political reasons, or not perhaps because of political reasons, but because of necessity. They will need to find ways to raid other cattle, to bring cattle back, because they lost so many cattle in the floods and the previous fighting. And what we mustn't allow is the deprivation to kick off another round of fighting that then can be manipulated into something more political and something greater.
Thank you.
So it's our role to continue the relief operations that we've already been started and we've already been working throughout the whole period, but to gear it up and raise our game. Because, I mean, food assistance can give people hope, but their future relies on peace, and the peace relies on the stability and the ability of communities to feed themselves, look after themselves, and meet their basic needs.
Gentlemen, we'll have to leave it there. Matthew Hollingworth, Douglas Johnson, Jeffrey Duke, I really appreciate your insight. Thank you. And thank you too for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Hashem Ahelbarra, and the entire team here in Doha. Bye for now.